This goddess Estrella, she decides to leave the earth, and she flees up and becomes the constellation of Virgo, specifically stationed in the main star Spica. But then we begin to see these prophecies and these writings that talk about her return, and that her return is going to restore the reign of Saturn, and that a child will be born, and that child is going to redeem that golden age.
Greetings from the Pacific Northwest. You're listening to Symbolic Studies Episode 8. I'm your host Mario, once again joined by my lovely wife Michelle. Today we'll be discussing the symbolism of Virgo, the sixth sign of the zodiac. If you're new to the show, I invite special guests to submit a voicemail on the topic at hand, and also play voicemails submitted by listeners like yourself. For more information about the show, my services, or how to submit a voicemail, please visit symbolicstudies.com. But before we dive into the first voicemail, Michelle, my dear, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful and happy to be here as always. Really looking forward to getting into Virgo and diving deep into this sign.
Yes, it's going to be a great episode. I've been looking forward to Virgo season. In fact, I'll say that over the years, it has become one of my favorite signs. And I've noticed that there's quite the fondness out there with my followers and subscribers with Virgo and Virgo season. And with that said, I'd love to kick things off with 3 back-to-back voicemails from our good friend Katriena, who always delivers the goods.
Hi, Mario and Michelle. It's Katriena from Down Under. Where do I begin? Virgo is probably one of my favorite zodiacal topics. But perhaps let's begin with Virgo as a remnant of the primordial goddess tradition, the Earth Mother, the All Mother, bringer of life and death. She is the thousand-named goddess in reference to the Paleolithic womb and tomb duality. The most popular myth surrounding Virgo is that of Demeter and Persephone, mother and daughter, Da meaning earth and arguably grain as well, Meta, mother, and Persephone meaning bringer of death. Here we have the archetypal double goddess, of which we find many across cultures and times, be it that they are 2 sisters or mother-daughter. This, to me, harkens back to the primordial beliefs of the feminine creatrix in cycles of life, death, and rebirth. So one could say Virgo belongs to the trope of resurrection myths, as we clearly see in the story of Persephone. This idea of resurrection can be traced far back into antiquity, especially linked to vegetal gods, should I say, and goddesses, as we have the oldest story found in that of the descent of Inanna to the underworld, as these mirror the seasonal changes in vegetal growth, harvest, death, and planting. What I also find interesting about Virgo, tying into the idea of births, Parthenos, is Virgo is the second largest constellation, in which it is markedly has a lozenge or diamond shape at its core. The diamond, when considering the archaeology of paleo symbols, is representative of the womb, the vulva. Curiously, one can argue as well that the Virgo glyph, which is like the letter M with a fish-like loop, that fish loop is implying the womb or vulva, as the fish is another prehistoric symbol of the vulva/womb. So just thought I'll share those thoughts on the womb symbolism there as well. Hi, Mario and Michelle. It's me again. This time I want to offer up a bit more of a controversial interpretation of Virgo. So as we know, Virgo, the word comes to mean maiden or unmarried woman, but it also has this other meaning of a virgin birth, often associated to miraculous births with famous people like Plato is said to have been born of a virgin mother, as well as many heroes, demigods, and gods throughout different cultures. Why do we have this idea of a virgin birth? And if we look at the term parthenogenesis, from which we derive the Greek word parthenos, it is asexual reproduction, which, as we know, we have found across plant and animal kingdoms, with many birds like doves, condors, vultures, as well as reptiles like frogs, crocodiles, fish, and even bees. But what I find interesting is we omit the possibility that that could have happened with the human race as well. And in my opinion, I think we can trace it back through the biology. So let's go back. Parthenogenesis, what happens there is mitosis, which is basically the cells are replicating and cloning themselves. Or meiosis as well, another form of it where it takes some DNA. Okay, so with parthenogenesis, if that was to happen in a woman, she is basically self-fertilizing herself. She's cloning herself and self-fertilizing the egg into an embryo. And, much of what we have today are very androcentric creation stories where we have a male god creating mankind. Hearkening back to the Garden of Eden story where God creates man in his image. Now, I find that wording very interesting. In his image. That would sound like in his likeness or a clone of himself, which is essentially what parthenogenesis is. For if a woman was to create that way, she would be essentially creating a clone of herself. And biologically, if this was to happen, it would only ever be a female that she would create. So I think this could also be in reference to why we find so many double and even triple goddesses in mythology, is that, even we find a lot of goddesses almost seem very clone-like or similar in characteristics and qualities as another goddess. So it's almost like we're duplicating them and replicating them. And when we look at, in terms of genomics, with, the humans having, we have 23 autosomes, but in women, they are 23 matching pairs of autosomes. But in men, it is 22 matching pairs, and the 23rd is the XY chromosome. So looking at the sex chromosome, in women it's double X, in men it's XY. And in fact, the Y chromosome is essentially a degeneration of the X chromosome. Because, for example, if the X chromosome, the X contains 1,000 protein coding genomes, then the Y is a third of that. So it only contains like 100. So that's why biologists would say it's a degeneration of the X chromosome. So I have this theory that it was the first woman that created mankind, being that perhaps she kept cloning herself, always a daughter, until one day there was a mutation and that X became a Y, and that's when we developed the male sex organs. And this is why we have this, particularly this mother-son relationship as well in mythology. So that's just my theory that, the Y chromosome is essentially a mutation of the X. And, isn't it kind of curious that in the major arcana, we have 22 cards, and the human race basically has 22 pairs, chromosomal pairs, but the 23rd is the sex chromosome, the XY. So I almost look at the 23rd, our sex chromosome, as the individuation. So when we have the 22, if the major arcana is symbolic of the hero's journey of individuation, then that 23rd, that invisible 23rd card would be our sex chromosome. That's just a wild theory of mine, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Last entry, I promise. But I really want to bring up the Hermit card. This one really stumped me. Why we have the Hermit card traditionally represented by an old man. And as we know, the Hermit card is associated with Virgo. So it seems kind of counterintuitive to have a man represent Virgo, but I would like to think this is sort of an overlay by patriarchal values. But if we trace back, the story of Corey, the maiden, the unmarried woman, the virgin, this was a time, this sort of goes back to a time when we had matrifocal, matriarchal society, and marriage didn't really exist. And I've heard it argued by some historians that when marriage was introduced, like, for example, we have the story of Persephone and her mother, Demeter, that story was a reflection of the times of when marriage was introduced into society. And that, in fact, Persephone going to the underworld was a sign of the daughters leaving their mothers to get married. Because traditionally speaking, what happened was in a matrifocal society was the women all lived in the same household. The mothers, the grandmothers, the daughters, all, they owned the property and they passed it down from the matrilineal, line. And that when marriage was introduced, then these women now had to leave their matrilineal home to travel to where the husband lived. And, that's reflected in this journey to the underworld in Persephone's story. So that was the morning of their independence, their sovereignty, because before marriage, women had their sovereignty. This idea of the hermit comes back to be symbolic of the woman living her life, her instinctual, creative life of her soul on her own path, being, also reference to that wild woman archetype that we find in Jungian psychology. This is indicative of the hermit who goes on their own path, who's self-contained, who lives instinctually, having that inner knowledge, that deep sense of knowing. And yeah, so that's my little weave linking the Hermit card to Virgo. And, it's even arguable that the clothes that the Hermit wears, it's very feminine. It's long robes, he's covered up like a veil over his head. And I think veil symbology is also linked to the hair symbology as well, and hair being a very spiritual quality, a spiritual force, life force, and also containing secrets as well.
Okay, thank you, Katriena, for those contributions. Excellent stuff, as always. If you've been listening to the show, she's probably a familiar voice at this point. Of course, there were a lot of excellent points brought up. There's a lot of things that we can get into, but she just finished talking about the Hermit card, and I do have some insights regarding the Hermit and how it does relate to Virgo. I loved her take. One interesting thing to consider here is that the Hermit is seeking that from which he came, and that would be the feminine. So notice that the Hermit is holding his light in the dead of night. Of course, daytime is generally associated with a masculine presence or energy. Nighttime is generally associated with the feminine. And so the fact that the Hermit is searching at night, to me, there's a feminine quality to that, essentially. Also, the Hermit card is very much associated with cave symbolism. And when you get into cave symbolism, it overlaps very, very closely with womb symbolism, essentially, right? And so the dynamic is that the Hermit is going into a phase of isolation. He's going through this hermetic sort of journey. And so he's symbolically unveiling parts of himself, right? And veil symbolism goes along very, very strongly with Virgo symbolism. I've said this before, but if there's a sign that relates to bridal symbolism, it would be Virgo through and through. And so obviously we have the tradition of unveiling the bride. Veil symbolism relates very strongly to concealing and revealing something, right? And there's many things that sort of work this way in this reality, I would say. What a lot of people have said and what I've come across as well is that the hymen symbolically is a veil, right? Hair symbolically can be viewed as a veil. And even the fact that the hermit is wearing this cloak with this hood, that's a symbolic veil. The hermit also has this long beard generally and a lot of hair. And so to me, there is a lot of symbolism in that regard as well as it relates to the veil. Adding to that, pubic hair can also be viewed as a symbolic veil as well, right?
Right.
And so he's going through this period of isolation to remove veils, right? To get closer to, I would say, his center, to that still point within. And in my opinion, this relates very strongly to this concept of a second birth. So there's this idea that when you go through your hermetic phase, that basically you are going through kind of a self-initiatory process, which can be viewed as a second birth. And initiation basically relates to this second birth as well. And there's also this concept of a third birth, right? So him retreating to be alone is him going back to the womb. So once again, going from which he came, seeking from which he came. So he's actually seeking things that relate to the feminine, and the card relates to Virgo. And so to me, that makes a lot of sense in that way. Also, there's a tradition showing the hermit as being a very phallic sort of symbol. He's very upright. He kind of looks like a phallus. He even generally has a staff, right? That's one of the traditions with the card. And I even have some cards, some older decks, they will show the hermit with a mushroom cap on, right? So the phallic symbolism is coming through even stronger, in those depictions of him, right? Now, here's the kicker, though. It's so interesting to me that people for a number of years have said that 3, 6, and 9 unlock secrets to the universe. And Nikola Tesla is the one that generally gets credited for that. 3, 6, and 9. And of course, 9 is divisible by 3 times. 6 is divisible by 3 times. And 3 itself is considered a magic number. And so there's even songs about this. 3 is the magic number, right? And that's totally true. I even think of like Hermes Trismegistus, right? The thrice great Hermes. And clearly he's a hermetic figure. So when we're dealing with the hermit basically means a little Hermes, pretty much, right? And Virgo is ruled by Mercury. Mercury corresponds with Hermes in a million different ways. And so the thing is that when you take the third card of the major arcana, it's the Empress. And then you take the 6th card of the major arcana, and that's the Lovers. And then you take the 9th card of the major arcana, and that's the Hermit. Just put those cards next to each other. 3, 6, and 9. 3, 6, and 9 unlocking secrets to the universe. The Empress, that is Virgo. That is the Harvest Maiden. She oftentimes has wheat right in front of her. Wheat symbolism and Virgo symbolism go hand in hand, as we'll be talking about throughout this episode. And so she literally is the grain goddess, right? She's the queen of heaven and the queen of earth. And so you are seeing a representation of Virgo in the Empress card, the third card of the major arcana, and she's looking to the right. And she is seen during the day, and she's also throned. Yep, and Michelle's gesturing to her belly, and so she's saying that the Empress looks like she's expecting, of course. That's part of the symbolism of the card. And then you have the Lovers card, and so you have literally a culmination of feminine and masculine coming together in the Lovers. And then we have the Hermit card. If you contrast the Empress card and the Hermit card, they are complete opposite cards. You have the woman throned and sitting in the third card. You have a man standing in the Hermit card. You have an old man with a long beard, and he's standing with his lantern at night as well. So when you just contrast the Empress card and the Hermit card, they're literally kind of opposing cards and complementary cards in many ways, I would say. It's as though the Hermit is seeking to commune with the divine feminine, essentially. And so you have the Empress on the left, the Hermit on the right, and then the 6th card is them actually coming together with the Lovers card. So that's another angle that I see with everything, is that with the tarot, you actually get opposing symbolism than what you would initially expect oftentimes. So with Virgo being the maiden and being the bride, it makes sense that you would have almost the exact opposite figure, an old man, on the card that symbolically represents Virgo. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying our discussion on Virgo symbolism so far. If you aren't already aware, I have a series called Symbolic Secrets that's only available through my site or via Patreon. At the moment, I'm releasing one episode for every major arcana card, and have released 17 so far. That's about 17 hours worth of exclusive content. Links for everything can be found at symbolicstudies.com. Or if you want to go straight to my Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/symbolicstudies. This is also the perfect way to support the show for only $5 a month. All right, back to the episode. And when we're dealing with the Hermit card, we're dealing with the number 9. And the number 9 has this amazing mathematical property that I have to talk about briefly. And it's that 9 always reduces and comes back to itself when you're multiplying 9. So, as an example, whenever you add 9 to itself or multiply it, you just reduce the numbers down and you return back to 9. So 9 plus 9 is 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. You add another 9, that's 27. 2 plus 7 is 9. You add another 9, that's 36. 3 plus 6 is 9. No matter how many times you do that, the numbers reduce back down to 9. And then even when you half 9 and you're using decimals, the exact same thing happens. So half of 9 is 4.5. 4 plus 5 is 9. Half of that is 2.25. 2 plus 2 plus 5 is 9. And so 9 always has this return to self, basically. And that's really what the Hermit card is all about. And with sort of the womb symbolism coming through and the vulva symbolism coming through with Virgo, it makes all of the sense in the world that there would be this return to self sort of dynamic. So those are a few things off the top of my head with the Hermit. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, there's so many things that come to mind, especially with the Hermit and the things you're bringing up. One of the things that constantly was pinging in my brain while you were talking was the metamorphosis that happens for a woman as she's going through menopause. And this to me is very symbolic of the Hermit, or the journey within, and the veils being lifted. And, anyone who's looked into menopause, or if you're a woman and you are experiencing some of these things, it definitely is this peeling back of yourself and a re-examination, a changing. You're going from the mother to the crone, which is one of the biggest transitions. I also think that men have the same metamorphosis. It just looks different for a man, and perhaps it's just not categorized in mainstream science or health or what have you, but there's no way that a man does not experience these same things. It just is in a different capacity, in my opinion, because if we are living out our true essence or power, hopefully we are changing. Hopefully we are lifting veils, and hopefully we are piercing our own veils in order to get to the next level that we should want to get to and to achieve, right? So that's what comes to mind with the Hermit and the female aspect of it. And just even on a physical level, thinking about the hot flash. What's a hot flash? What does that mean? I've heard many things about hot flashes. I've begun to experience hot flashes myself. And one of the things that I think I've talked about before is that a hot flash potentially could actually be the Kundalini rising in a woman. And that is what's actually happening. That's the heat you're feeling. That's what's coming up almost to be healed, or what is arising in you that wants to kind of explode out the top.
Wow, that's really, really interesting, because one of the classic ways people have imagined the Kundalini rising would be with two serpents going up the spine, right? That's a classic sort of depiction of that. And that essentially is the caduceus.
Right.
And you will see Virgo literally holding the caduceus sometimes. Because the caduceus also relates to Mercury Hermes. And so, once again, Virgo is literally ruled by Mercury. And it makes sense that this would be related as well, because we have 33 vertebrae, right, in our spine. And as I was saying, there's a whole sort of connection with Hermes and the number 3. So 33 vertebrae the Kundalini serpents going up the spine. And also you will see literally the hermit as well. On occasion, his staff will have a serpent wrapped around it, right? And so to me, that makes all the sense in the world. That's very, very interesting. Actually, there's a whole serpentine weave with the hermit as well. There's multiple versions of the hermit card that depict a serpent. So I don't think I've ever heard that before. I like that, though.
Oh, yeah. The first person I heard that from was actually Susan Weed, great herbalist. If you don't know who she is, I recommend her work. If you're interested in learning about herbalism, and she has more of a spice to her, and she does have a little bit more of a bent towards esoteric information, and she always puts her own twist on how she presents that, you know, with it, whether it's in a book or a presentation or something. But there's so many little nuggets like that that she pulls from or has made connections to when it comes to relating even to more of the esoteric side of the world.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. So the other thing I'll just say about that is Hermes, Mercury, is well known for being a psychopomp. And so he goes between realms. Symbolically, he goes between realms via the world axis or axis mundi, which essentially kind of can be imagined as a bridge or a pole or a post or a column or a staff or something along these lines. Our spine is a symbolic representation of that as well. So when you imagine a serpent wrapped around a tree going up a tree, or the Kundalini serpents going up the spine, it's no different than Mercury going to different realms of reality, basically, through this axis or through this bridge. So just thought I would put that out there as well.
Yeah, that's a great one. And one of the other things that this analogy does is it helps you to not fear a hot flash. Because I think in mainstream media or medical terms or whatever you want to say, hot flashes and menopause are feared, or it's like, oh my God, I'm going through menopause. Oh no, I have a hot flash. Oh, it's the worst thing in the world. And what this Kundalini thing does is it helps you to realize that, no, this is actually a good thing. Embrace it, breathe through it, acknowledge what it might be, and be grateful for it, because it's actually your body's way of allowing you to, as we were talking about, release this energy and actually lift a veil that you've probably needed to lift throughout your life in order to learn something deeper about yourself, so that you can gain the wisdom that you've been hopefully working towards throughout your entire life.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So a couple of other things that Katriena mentioned that I wanted to touch upon. This idea of women getting married being a symbolic representation of going to the underworld, I think is really interesting. I've never heard that take before, but there are a few things to kind of consider with that, because I've also considered when man has sex with a woman, that there's a symbolic element that, in my opinion, feels as though the man is going to the underworld.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and to me, that makes all the sense in the world as well. And so I know we refer to it as the underworld oftentimes, but there's a huge correspondence with the underworld actually being in the sky, not literally underground, not in the ocean, but somewhere in the heavens, and specifically, actually, the gateway to the underworld being the northern sky. There's a lot to be said about that. And so again, this bridge that Hermes travels on to get to other domains basically goes to the northern sky. And in my opinion, I think that when a man is having sex with a woman, it's almost like his little Hermes is going to that underworld.
Right.
And there's a whole sexual aspect to the Hermit card, Virgo symbolism. There's an aspect here that relates to masturbation and ritual masturbation. I even put that in one of my Virgo videos about the different gods masturbating life into existence. This also relates to Mary being given a flower that was sort of the catalyst for her to have a virgin birth with Christ. And some people have made the case that the flower symbolically kind of represents an act of self-love. And that's one of the deep encoded aspects of lily symbolism that you'll find when you look into the lily, that there's sort of a self-love dynamic going on there. And in my opinion, if there's a sign that relates to masturbation or self-love, it's definitely Virgo. Also, what Katriena had to say regarding the degeneration of chromosomes from the X to the Y. Personally, for me, that's all really well received and well taken. I think it makes a lot of sense that that could very well be the case. So I very much appreciated that. Just have to say as well that there are a few interpretations on the fleur-de-lis symbol, right? That has three main aspects to it, I would say. And the most common interpretation is that it's literally a representation of some lilies. And fleur-de-lis means flower of the lily. And so the fleur-de-lis basically is a sort of icon of the Madonna or the Virgin Mary as well. And so France is well known for incorporating a lot of fleur-de-lis symbolism into their culture. And there's a lot of people that take that specific symbol as, on one hand, it's a symbol of the Trinity, but there are a lot of people who deliberately associate it with the Virgin Mary as well. The Virgin Mary, who basically is sort of a representation of Virgo herself, the modern day Christianized sort of version of Virgo.
Another flower that comes to mind that has recently come into our weave is Datura. And as soon as you brought up flower, I thought of this because one of the things that we talked about was the fact that our Datura plant has been blooming. This is the first year that I've successfully grown this plant from seed. And the first night that it bloomed was actually on the new moon just last week. And we talked about how Virgoan this flower actually is. And when you approach it and when you see it, you get that sense of this very intriguing, mysterious, dark yet light, because the flower is like a stark white and it's very bright in the night like a moon. And to me, I've just been so drawn to this flower and being able to see it. It's so feminine in its scent and its shape. And it is like a lady of the night. And I also think of that when I think of Virgo, because there's always the light and the dark aspect, which I think this plant really illustrates beautifully, because the flower itself is like this pure white, but then it does have a dark side to it. And it is within the nightshade family, which is considered to be a poison plant, for lack of better terms. But one of the things I came across when researching it is that in the Chinese tradition, this flower is known as one of the pole star flowers. And so there is something about this flower that helps you to tap into yourself. There's an inward journey that can be taken when you are even in the presence of this flower. There's also something about it that you can read about and you can experience yourself, but an element of piercing the veil with this flower, because there is a psychedelic aspect to it when it is taken in a low dose. I don't have experience with that quite yet, but I do know that just reading accounts of it and even being in its presence and really meditating with it, there is some sort of lifting of your consciousness or your mood that comes with even breathing in the scent of the flower. And it really encourages communication with the other side. So there's this element of opening channels.
Yeah, no, exactly. And just because I think a lot of people have no experience with this flower, just to clarify this nighttime aspect with Datura, it blooms once and then the petals fall off, but it blooms at night.
Yes.
That's an important aspect here, right?
Yeah, it's super important. And it's really, really intriguing to watch, actually, because it starts out as a very tight spiraled flower. And as the sun starts to go down and it becomes dusk, you are watching this flower just slowly, slowly open. And by the time it is fully dark, the flower has opened and outstretched almost to the point where like the sides of it are curling outward and like back into itself in some way, because it is just like so open and it like loves the energy of the night. And so I really wanted to bring that in today, and you bringing up the flower seemed like a perfect opportunity.
Hi, Mario and Michelle, calling in to talk to you about Virgo energy. Now, I think Virgo gets an interesting reputation in pop culture. They're often portrayed as being perfectionists, and certainly it is true that on the rudimentary level, Virgo energy is very good at entering into a system of culture or a system of assumptions or unwritten rules and figuring out how to navigate those rules in a way that creates success. But much more interesting than just this surface level interpretation of Virgo energy is when you dive into exactly what Virgo energy is doing in the body, and also exactly what Virgo energy is doing in systems like tarot and alchemy and the Kabbalah. So, first of all, in the body, Virgo rules the intestine. And you really can't go too far down this path without getting into certain mythological stories. So on the surface level, the intestine, what does it do? Well, it helps us to digest food, and it helps us to digest experience. If you look at certain medical traditions like Ayurveda, they will say that disease is caused when digestion has not happened properly, either of actual food or of experience. And so Virgo is a sign that is associated with health. Now, if you continue down this path of exploring the intestine, you don't go too far till you get into discussions around the gut-brain connection. And this can happen on a very basic level, like we have a gut instinct to make a different choice, or this can happen at a very subtle level. And this is where we get into the mythology I was talking about before. So Virgo is the virgin. It's also Ceres, which is the goddess that was the primary goddess in the Eleusinian mysteries, and who was later sort of pushed aside, but she's a sort of Mother Earth figure. So it's the virgin, it's Ceres, and it's the house of bread. Of course, Virgo season is the harvest season in many regions on Earth. The house of bread is also a reference to the intestine, and Ceres is a goddess of the earth and of harvest. So we have Virgo, the virgin. And we have this understanding of what a virgin is in our sort of modern context. And then we have all of these stories in mythology. There's some in ancient Egypt, there's some in India, there's some in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Notably, I will mention the story of Christ, like Jesus Christ, and Krishna, both being born of virgins and both in their own way being completely enlightened, solar encoded deities. Both also having this sort of mythology around them being babies. So, and then of course growing and becoming adults and doing what they do later on. So this idea of Krishna, Christ, similar root there, being born of a virgin, comes from, among other things, medical astrology and our understanding that the virgin or Virgo ruled section of the body is the birthing point of this sort of higher enlightenment, this Krishna consciousness, this Christ consciousness. And of course, the word Christ just means anointed, or the soma that drips from just beyond the third eye point. Now, interestingly, when we have enlightenment happen in individuals, there's a physiological component that does occur. And this occurs because of the slight alteration in the way that the intestine, the digestive tract ruled by Virgo, receives the chyme and processes that through the blood-brain chemistry and creates some shift in the pineal gland, which is largely associated with the third eye point. So when we're dealing with Virgo, it's really hard not to mention these sort of mythologies where a enlightened figure is born of a virgin. And then we have, of course, the same metaphor in our own bodies, that each person is able to move toward higher and higher states of enlightenment. And there is a connection between the gut and the brain that occurs in this. Now, I mentioned before the Hermit card, or at least I mentioned the tarot in passing. There's some really interesting information encoded in the Hermit card in the tarot. But before I get into that, I want to mention that Mercury rules Virgo, and Mercury is also exalted in Virgo. And so Mercury is the planet, or in alchemy, the metal by which the work gets done. It's the intellect, it's the curious intellect that allows us to move into a state of higher states of consciousness. And one of the things that's really important about this mercurial quality is that Mercury has to operate not as the automatic mind, but as the wisdom mind. And so Virgo, with its receptivity in the intestine and its capacity to digest experience and show us the light that comes even in the darkness, right? This is what allows us to get the work done. Otherwise, the sort of controlling cyclical mind won't let us break out of our habitual thought patterns to get curious about, well, what would happen if I meditate, if I explore, this topic, if I let go of some of my habitual ways of thinking, my consciousness patterns that are based on groupthink or even on hatred or vibrations lower than the level of awareness, right? What would happen if that shifted? So we have ruled by Mercury, with Mercury exalted, helping us get this work done. And then in the tarot, we have this really interesting image that I think I'm going to maybe run out of time before I get into fully. But we have the Hermit card. Of course, the Hermit in many decks has his hat as a yud, one of the sacred letters in the Yud He Vav He. And we have the Hermit dressed all in gray. And this is the understanding that something which has once been colorful, patterned a certain way, has been neutralized. And the Hermit is holding out a lantern, usually with a 6-pointed star, symbolizing the merger between fire and water, masculine, feminine, yin, yang, right? We have the 6-pointed star, and he's holding the lantern out, shining the path that he has just traversed up the mountain. And so we see here in the Virgo card a symbol of what happens when we do follow this path. And of course, the path at the top of the mountain is somewhat lonely, but it's a card of actually showing us that people have already traversed this path and that they stand lighting the way for others. And so when we follow our gut instinct, but not our habitual ways of thinking, right? Our true instinct that is born from our capacity to actually digest life and then create light out of that, or to find the light within that. That is what's pictured in this card. And there's so much more sort of to dive into with that one. But I know you do a ton with tarot, so you're gonna get into it perfectly. As you discuss these mythologies and these stories, you'll find more and more hints to what's going on, hints about climbing the spine up to points of enlightenment, which are located in the head space and the chakras in the head. You'll find references to Virgo. In the Christ story, it comes up often that he's born in Bethlehem, right? Beth, house, Lehem, right, of bread, the house of bread. There's so much in these stories, but I think the main thing I wanted to share about Virgo energy is that it is all about the digestion of experience and the capacity to actually allow the intestine to digest things in such a way that we can grow, and that human beings can and do grow far beyond what we have been led to believe societally is possible. So that's just the gist of what we talk about in yoga and astrology and astro yoga. So I hope this is helpful. Thanks for all this cool content you're putting out. And I hope you all are having a beautiful start to Virgo season. Also, this Virgo season is eclipse season. And if you count by the zodiac signs, we'll have a black moon for our second new moon, which will also be an eclipse. Okay, have a beautiful day.
Okay, Emily, thank you so much for the contribution. I love the fact that you're always bringing it back to the body. Makes a lot of sense given your yoga background and medical astrology background. One of the things she mentioned early on was the aspect of digestion being related to not only food in your intestines, but also the aspect of digesting experience, right? And this really resonates with me very strongly because over the years, both of us have really gotten interested in sort of the symbolic dynamic of our senses and different parts of the body and our organs, and how there really truly is a relationship with the different parts of your bodies and its function and your experience. And as an example, you know, if you are having a hard time digesting something in life, that might show itself as digestive issues in the physical body. We've heard many examples where people have, say, heard something that was difficult to hear, and then they develop hearing issues because of that, right? Mm-hmm. We actually have some friends who have written books on this whole entire dynamic. Some people refer to this as German New Medicine, but it goes by a lot of other names, right? So that was one of the things I just wanted to mention right off the bat. Also, as she was talking about all of this intestinal stuff, being the house of bread symbolically, and the correspondence with Virgo, I couldn't not think of the correlation some symbologists and some myths have made with the labyrinth and your intestines. And that it's kind of like a symbolic labyrinth, right? And to me, this is kind of striking because when you look at old labyrinths, they're more circular in nature. When we think of a maze in today's world, oftentimes it's kind of within a square-like environment, but a lot of old labyrinths were circular, and they all had this sort of sacred center that you wanted to find or uncover. And she was talking about the intestines being the birthing point. So this would be the point in the middle of the labyrinth. And the interesting thing about the labyrinth as well is it's kind of illusory. And as you're getting to the center of any system, it's as though you're piercing a series of veils, right? And some of these old labyrinths actually were designed in such a way that when you count from the outside of the labyrinth towards the center of the labyrinth, some of these old labyrinths had 7 layers to it. And the number 7 was really important in alchemy and transmutation and transformation. Kind of related to that, actually, in Islam, they say that there's 70,000 veils between us and the face of God.
Wow.
Right? And so encoding that number 7 and also encoding veil symbolism. One presentation that I did early on was called 7 Gates to the Great Beyond, and how a lot of different cultures have this idea of encoding the number 7, that you need to cross 7 thresholds, 7 veils, or that there's 7 processes to transmute something, right? Maybe from lead to gold would be one example. So the labyrinth is related to the intestines as well, and there is this dynamic of seeking the center point of the labyrinth, getting to that still point within. Reminds me very much of some of the Hermit symbolism we were just talking about. So I just wanted to bring that up. I also love the bread symbolism, and with Bethlehem being the house of bread, right? Bet being house. The card in the major arcana that relates to Bet or Beth is the Magician card, which is ruled by Mercury. And so what I say with that card with the magician holding a wand up to the heavens and then pointing his other hand down to the ground. He's basically saying, I connect the above and below, and I am the central pillar in the house of God. That's what he's saying. He's basically kind of declaring himself as the world axis, actually, in many ways. So the fact that Beth is coming around right now, this bread symbolism, the house of bread, with this sign that literally is ruled by Mercury, I thought was really appropriate as well. So with that said, was there anything you wanted to mention regarding Emily's voicemail?
Yes, indeed. One of the things that stands out to me is the concept of true instinct versus habitual instinct. And on a personal level, I'll say this dynamic is coming up for me currently right now in my life. It's interesting to me because our habitual judgments can be taken as an intuitive hit. And it's something that I'm having to process right now. And so discerning whether is this really an intuitive hit or is this coming from a place of fear, of judgment, of irrational projection of something, or is this a genuine gut intuitive hit that you need to really follow? And I've found that throughout my journey of kind of going into more of the intuitive realms or learning about intuition, learning about psychic abilities, whatever you want to call that, there's this thing that happens in the New Age la la land that there is just this seemingly constant spiral of irrational intuition, hit sort of following things almost blindly with this kind of thing. And I think that the habitual instinct can overtake what is a genuine concern, if that makes any sense. And so as soon as she brought it up, it was just like, wow, I can really relate to that and I resonate with it. And because it's something that I am also working on right now, I had to go there and bring it up and just say how much I appreciate the fact that she's bringing that into the fold.
Right. Well, I did notice the first time we listened to the voicemail, because this is our second time now, that point is what stuck out the most for you. And being your partner, being your husband, I know full well what you're talking about. Too much to unpack in this episode. But yeah, that's definitely really well taken. And I'm glad she proposed it or kind of put it that way, because it really simplifies kind of the conversation about some of what we've been talking about, behind the scenes. So yes, that's very, very well taken. Also, one of the things I wanted to mention, just regarding this aspect of light symbolism and also solar symbolism, which corresponds very strongly with light, this idea that the hermit is lighting his way for others, I really love that, because essentially the way I personally take it is, when you look at the hermit, I think what you're seeing is an elder shepherd. And I think basically what you're seeing is an elder Christ. I think that if we were to see Christ in his older years, I think he might look like the hermit, actually. And literally there's depictions of Christ with a lamb on his shoulders. He was the good shepherd as well. And there's even hermetic figures, like I'm thinking of Hermes Kriophoros. He has a lamb on his shoulders, and he also was a good shepherd. There's a lot of these same solar deities that she was talking about that have shepherd symbolism baked into their whole entire storyline, right? And so, to me, the hermit has all of the signatures that he's actually Christ. The cards are ruled by Virgo. That would be his mother. He is the psychopomp. He is the guide of souls, basically. That's kind of another way of looking at it, is he's the good shepherd. And so you can imagine his flock that he protects, that he takes to greener pastures. But sort of a larger, more grander aspect of that symbolism is that he's the good shepherd in the afterlife, that he's the conductor of souls, that he's a psychopomp. He takes people to the other side, essentially. He lights the way for others, which is what Emily said. I encourage people to maybe check out my video where I talk about this symbolism more, because there's actually a lot of curious connections that once you see the hermit as potentially a Christ-like figure, you kind of can't unsee it. And when you consider that Christ is a solar figure and I would say additionally a mercurial figure, it makes sense that the Hermit represents essentially the same sort of dynamic. On one hand, he's holding the light. There's that sort of solar element there, but obviously there's this unmistakable mercurial aspect with him as well. Being a traveler, Mercury is the messenger of the gods, and I think when you're looking at earlier versions of Christ, he comes off actually as being way more mercurial. In fact, some of the earliest depictions of Christ, he's holding a wand because he's performing magic, right? And so over time, I think he's become more and more solar. And so one of the things I also wanted to mention here is that the Gnostic creation story really, really comes through with both Virgo and Leo, in my opinion. So just briefly, the Gnostic creation story is that there was a feminine presence. Her name was Sophia. Essentially, she is the cosmos or the universe. She is a virgin because she has no partner, because no such partner existed. So she's on her own, right? But deep, deep, deep within her, she birthed this light. And this light was known as the Demiurge. The Demiurge is a lion-headed serpent and has a lot of symbolism associated with Leo, which is the sign that comes right before Virgo. And so this was the first masculine presence, essentially, in this story. And the Demiurge thought that he was the supreme deity. He did not know that there was a god above him, which basically is the goddess, right? And so I think you're actually seeing sort of a demiurgic Virgo solar child storyline when you're looking at the strength card. The woman might as well be Sophia, and of course the lion might as well be the Demiurge. And I think that this storyline, this overall basic kind of narrative is so epic, but it's seemingly very, very much, I wouldn't say exactly universal, but almost nearly universal. Because when you're looking at Virgo holding Christ, it's basically the same storyline, essentially, right? And it kind of circles back around to some of what Katriena said regarding the X and Y chromosomes, basically men being somewhat of a mutation from the feminine, right? I think there's a ton to be said about that. You know, all embryos start off as feminine. And so they're all female to begin with. And then the ovaries descend into testicles, and then that's what creates a man, essentially, a boy. And so we all start off as being women, you know, and so this is the primordial original gender, in my estimation. It seems as though all of the symbolism really points to that. And I think you're going to see sort of echoes of that in the tarot as well.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you guys. Hey, Michelle. Hey, Mario. So, Virgo symbolism. It's a pleasure to come back and share on this because this bookends Aries symbolism, which I think I discussed some of the feast days associated with Judaism the last time when we discussed Aries. And so how Virgo bookends this is that generally in the fall you'll have a cluster of what are known as the fall feasts. And so this begins with Yom Teruah, or the Day of Trumpets, and that's followed by Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, or what has been become a colloquially known as Judgment Day. And so when we see the figure of Virgo in the sky, she's standing beside Libra, the scales, and Scorpio, the scorpion. But this can actually be interchanged with the sword, which is used to point to the letter of the law. It could also be interchanged with the sting of death given by an adder, for instance. So if you see a left-handed figure, you know, bearing a serpent in their left hand, or holding a scorpion in the left hand, or a sword in the left hand, this is considered Garuva in Kabbalah, or severity, judgment. And so based on the adherence to the law, the letter of the law, justice is meted out on Judgment Day. And except this is a little more abstract, of course, from the religious standpoint, and that of course, there's the belief that your salvation is not earned through your works and your labor. Of course, it's not with the gift of salvation, but at any rate, the Jews believed that their spiritual labor was part of what's called tikkun alun olam, rather, to repair the world. And so it's thought that with the each mitzvah that you complete by following each commandment of the Torah, that we're repairing the world. And so the Virgo represents this idealistic restoration of the world and a new heaven on earth, if you will. And the temple is the seed from which that sprouts. And so it begins with that being in the center of the 12 tribes. It would then branch out, but of course it wasn't destined to happen back in the day. But when we read about things like the millennial kingdom and how it'll fill the earth, it'll be from Jerusalem that it swells, right? And like a mustard seed, it'll grow. And so when we see the high priestess seated, we know that that's probably the same figure that's appearing as the Empress, but in that archetype she's perhaps more mature and now pregnant, carrying the child. And so when we see a high priestess holding the Torah scroll on her lap, that is the Logos, the child that will be, right? And then in the Empress, we see that she is bearing the child now, just like Mary in the temple. And so once the child's born, then we see it's associated with the sun card, or the happiness card, right? And we get that red feather that kind of follows him through the tarot. But in many cases, like I said, we see the female figure being this feminine figure that also appears in the strength card. So for a moment, I'll discuss how that applies here. So we see the lady, the maiden, reaching into the mouth of the lion, which is an adversary. So it's not non-aggressive. Just like with Daniel in the lion's den, he had the obedience factor going for him, where he's following the law of God, and therefore he's preserved, right? So he's given salvation. But what is in the mouth of the lion is teeth. So the Hebrew letter that is associated with teeth is the shin. So here we can almost kind of say how the shin, or son of God, or in this case Mary, is depicted there with her in the strength card as well as the Lion of Judah, or coming back, the lamb slain, coming back as the Lion of Judah for Judgment Day. So that wasn't apparent to me till I started discussing this, and it came to me just now. So I'm glad that we can share that epiphany together. But a lot of times when you see the mother and child depicted with her and with the son in her lap, rather, that's the same type of relationship that I'm discussing here with the shin. So salvation's delivered through the Virgin, or the Virgo archetype in this case. And so I'm going to read a little excerpt here concerning Ruth. And so in the conversation that followed between Boaz and Ruth, in the Midrash, Ruth Rabbah states that being a pious man, Boaz, on his first meeting with Ruth, perceived her conscientiousness in picking up the grain, as she strictly observed the rules prescribed by the law. This, as well as her grace and her chaste conduct during work, induced Boaz to inquire about the stranger. And it goes on down here where he actually says, may God who rewards the pious also reward you. So he blesses her later in the story. And this is kind of lending itself to the fact that she was following the law very, very carefully, and that's what was important to her, is that she was doing these things correctly. And so he saw those qualities in her, and actually prophesied over her that she was going to bear the Messiah. So the salvation is delivered through her. So she is, Ruth in this sense, is very much the Virgo archetype, just like with Mary and later on. Of course, it took 42 generations for Christ to arrive, so Ruth found herself within that series of generations, right, leading up to Christ. And so when we see Virgo depicted in the zodiacal form, she's bearing a sheaf of wheat, and that's denoting fruitfulness, which of course is also the sun, the fruit of her womb. And so she's also wearing a robe, which is a fruit of the loom. And so loom is also associated with women, and she also married because she was also doing loom work for the temple. In fact, I think she may have even did the veil for the Holy of Holies. And that was the veil that was rent when Christ was crucified, right? So we see how that kind of loops back in itself. But I was talking about Boaz a moment ago, and so when we go back to the High Priestess card, we see that she's seated between two pillars, Jachin and Boaz. And Boaz represents strength and foundation, and so it's kind of like the right and left hand. One's stronger than the other, typically. And seated between them is, of course, the High Priestess holding the Torah scroll, like I said. So when we see the Virgo in the sky holding the instrument of death and with the scales, she's judging by the letter of the law whether or not we get to live or die, right? And so that's what the Jews would look at Judgment Day as, is the new year is going to get written. And so based upon your prior performance and your fruitfulness of your labor, very Saturnian nature, right? Based on all that performance data, you were then given a raise or a blessing, or what, just met the goal and you get a pass, whatever it might be. And so if you didn't, then you could be plagued with misfortune or something like that, because it was thought that in this period of time at the end of a calendar year, many different cultures, based on their calendar's end date, they consider these times rather perilous because there's no ritual at this time, and so there's no protection. And so this is also the time of year where there's not a lot of Torah study being performed because the temples and study halls are kind of shut down. And so this is thought to be a particularly dangerous time of year for accidents and misfortune because of that thing. So I would encourage people to study their Old Testament particularly, and spend time in prayer and meditation and maybe even fasting as we approach Judgment Day, just so that we can fully absorb the lessons that we have to learn here from the various tarot and paths on the Kabbalah tree. So thank you so much for allowing me to share this with you. And until next time, may the pumpkin spice flow.
Thank you, Joshua. It's always great to hear your perspective on things, of course. Babe, are you ready for the pumpkin spice to flow with?
I am, actually. I do enjoy pumpkin spice.
Oh, I know you do. So a number of things to talk about here, as always. I found it to be very, very interesting that he mentioned Mary doing loom work to create the veil that is in the temple. I did not know that, and that, to me, that's really interesting. I'm going to follow up on that. It makes a lot of sense on a number of levels. But one of the things I just want to point out here is in the High Priestess card, which a lot of times the High Priestess looks exactly like the Virgin Mary. She is sitting between these two pillars that Joshua was talking about. And then you see the veil between these two pillars. And literally there is fruit on the veil itself. And in this case, oftentimes it's pomegranates, and the pomegranates are laid out like the Kabbalistic tree of life. So to me, that's really, really intriguing. I'm really glad you brought that up. And also, I've noticed that there's a huge weave between lunar symbolism and weavers, or those who might work on a loom. And oftentimes, the Virgin Mary, literally, she's standing on top of a crescent moon. And in a lot of versions of the High Priestess card, she also is standing, or rather she's throned, but her feet are on top of a crescent moon. So it kind of lines up with that as well, right? He also mentioned Shin, and Shin in Hebrew is the letter that means teeth, basically. And he brought that up in relation to the jaws of the lion and also to Judgment Day. And I just have to point out as well, it's just another tarot weave, but the Judgment card is the card that corresponds with Shin and corresponds with teeth and tooth symbolism. In fact, you'll even see in the Crowley version of the same card, he doesn't call it the Judgment card, but he calls it the Aeon card. You will see that there's a child, the crowned and conquering child on that card is literally touching a tooth for that reason, right? And so those things I thought were very, very interesting. Did you pick up anything, Bob?
Yeah, Joshua, as always, bringing it, and really nice to hear his perspective. One of the things that was intriguing to me was the veil and it being made by Mary. And I'd never heard that either. But I do have another quote, actually, that corresponds with this. And it's, again, from Barbara Walker, because she's just so great. And there's so many great connections she makes. But veils were formerly worn by widows in expression of their crone character. Then it was said the veil was to protect the woman from attack from the ghost world when her spouse had gone. Then brides were veiled because at a transitionary stage in life, they were thought especially vulnerable to evil influences. Nuns and Islamic women were veiled to conceal their sexuality. I really liked how she goes through the whole procession of the veil. And so thinking about the High Priestess card as well and how the whole card is set up, it really just kind of drives these points home of the veil being tied to a woman, and then lo and behold, a woman being the one that created the veil.
You mentioned something about the Islamic world. And, you know, obviously we have the burqa and everything else, and there's different styles of veils. Well, one of the things that I just have to mention here, it's so interesting to me that their main pilgrimage location is Mecca, and everyone's going to see the Kaaba cube. You go to the Kaaba cube and you circumambulate around it 7 times. If you are of that faith, you are praying towards Mecca 5 times a day. And the cube itself, the Kaaba cube, I've read translates to House of the Mother. And so it's actually a feminine symbol. And so you wouldn't necessarily think it, but it is. It's a feminine symbol. And it's interesting because the Kaaba cube itself also literally wears a veil called the kiswa. And so the black that you see, the black and gold cloth that you see on the cube is literally veil symbolism.
Wow.
And so, and there's also too, symbolically in traditional Muslim households, there's kind of a symbolic veil with the quarters that separate the men and women. And so that's what a harem basically is. That a harem basically was the part of the home that was designated for the women, and that it was for their protection and it was for their benefit even, so they can just be women, right? And so even just this idea of separation to me is kind of like a symbolic, you know, veil as well. And so, yeah, there's a lot kind of going on there that I think is fascinating. Also, kind of circling back to the Empress card, which I brought up earlier, to me it's very clear that the Empress is a representation of Virgo. You've got the wheat right in front of her as an example. And once you start looking into the symbolism, it just makes a lot of sense that that is who she is. And so what we're seeing to me is you're seeing sort of the terrestrial mother. And what comes before her is the High Priestess. She's kind of more of the spiritual mother. So the High Priestess would be the spiritual mother, and the Empress would kind of be the everyday mother. And she's being seen during the day, but yet she has a tiara or a crown of stars. 12 stars to be exact in the Rider-Waite version. And so she is the Queen of Heaven. She is the stellar virgin. In the Rider-Waite version, she's even holding a wand with a golden orb on top of it. And to me, the symbolism behind this goes back to this woman who is veiled in light or clothed or robed in light. That's just the surface level sort of impression of her. That when you look at a woman and she's approachable, she's pretty, she maybe is just an everyday mother, something along these lines, that just barely scratches the surface of who she really is. There's way, way more underneath that external veil, essentially. And so I just wanted to bring up this idea that light itself can also be a veil. It can be blinding and all of these different types of things. And there's a number of myths that really relate back to this woman veiled in light, essentially. And I think that that's kind of what you're seeing when you see the bride as well. And I think that every woman has a relationship with kind of being an incarnation of the Queen of Heaven, of being a stellar virgin, of being a stellar goddess, right? So every woman is basically a representation of Virgo in her own right. But when you see her on the daily, you're not necessarily going to think that because she's quote unquote veiled in light. But in actuality, there's way, way more going on beneath all that.
Great points all around. And the thing that comes right to my mind when you're saying the things about light is the analogy of a moth to a flame. And the obvious attraction that happens between man and woman, or even just the beauty of a woman, regardless of what sex you are. Most people can acknowledge the beauty of the womanly form. And a lot of times you hear that sometimes even women who are attracted to men will even say like they'd rather see a naked woman over a naked man. And that's a very common, thing that you hear talked about. And that's for obvious reasons. Most people can agree with that. And so that is what I'm thinking of with this thought of the light and how we are kind of attracted to it, but we can also be blinded by the light. And what happens when you're blinded by the light? What happens when you are consumed with the light or consumed with the disassociation that happens when you are blinded by a light? You can, all sorts of things can happen. It's like the deer in headlights sort of thing as well. So just something to throw in there when we're talking about light.
Definitely. I mean, that's kind of one of the things about this reality, I would say, is that there's so many things that are kind of illusory or veil-like. And you think you're getting one thing, but you're actually getting another thing. You think that once you acquire whatever it might be, that suddenly you're going to be content or happy or what have you. And that there is kind of this dynamic there where sometimes you're getting more than meets the eye, or sometimes you're getting more than what you bargained for, right? And so that person who you might be attracted to, where on the surface level everything looks pretty appealing, there's actually more going on potentially underneath the surface that is worth sort of considering.
Hi there. So first of all, I must say the English, it's not my first language, but I'll do my best. And please ignore the mistakes that I might commit while I'm talking. But, I'm thinking about the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar, and how we can understand her as a symbol of Virgo sign, not just because of the image of the maiden, the virgin, and like those delicate stuff that people associate to the sign, but also because of this transition from Leo to Virgo, because she always has these creatures by her side, like Leos and Alls, and how we can understand her as a symbol of the feminine side of the conscience, who integrates the primal needs, the human primal needs, the animal instincts, because it's not just about taming these creatures, it's about having them by our side so we can have this vital energy available to new activities. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but how not just only this goddess, but how the maiden image of Virgo is capable of doing this work. I think that's it. If I do say anything else, I'm gonna say too much. But thanks a lot for hearing.
All right, Patricia, thank you so much for that voicemail. I totally understand where you're coming from with this one. And actually, it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of older versions of the Strength card where basically the woman is being shown as like a warrior. And so I'm kind of thinking of this primal kind of dynamic that she's trying to put out there. And of course, in the strength card, you have woman and lion, the virgin and the lion, or Virgo and Leo. So yeah, that's a huge aspect. That's kind of related to some of what I was just talking about with this veil of light. There's more underneath the surface. There's this primal sort of aspect. And I would say, really, to me, in my opinion, Virgo is another expression of what some people might refer to as the Dark Mother. And I think you really get a lot of Dark Mother symbolism between Virgo, Libra, and Scorpio. Scorpio might be the queen of Dark Mother symbolism, but when we're talking about Virgo and Scorpio, they're both related to each other. And there's a whole entire dynamic where people have said over the years, it's possible that Virgo, Libra, and Scorpio were one large sign. Libra was introduced, and basically it split up this massive sign into 3 smaller signs. And this explains why Virgo and Scorpio are both basically on opposite ends of the scales of Libra. And they both have glyphs that look like M's. Of course, Virgo has a glyph of the M with the embedded fish. And then Scorpio has that M glyph, but with the stinger of the scorpion, right? So it's really, they're kind of 2 sides of the same coin in many, many ways. And so the primal dynamic, though, of what she's trying to explain and how that relates to her different animal connections, in my opinion, is well received. It's definitely there. You might just have to lift the veil a little bit to see that dynamic.
I agree, and I can relate to these points as well. And what it makes me think of when I think about the animalistic or primal side of woman is always the wise woman and the original healer, or you might want to call a witch, or however you want to classify this, but the wise woman who followed the folk or primordial healing traditions always comes to mind when I think about this aspect because of its importance and its basis of healing, and now how we look at medicine and things like this. You know, we've kind of lost a lot of those primordial or folk traditions depending on the route you're going to take in healing. I think it's important to remember that true healing is going to come from within, which is what I believe wise women or witches were getting at. That was their basis of providing healing or providing the things that they would actually think would help you to go to that center within yourself.
Yeah, that's the most holistic way of looking at it, in my opinion. Not necessarily what's happening externally, but what's happening internally, right?
Right.
So first and foremost, Mario, thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective on your platform. I originally recorded a free flow on Virgo, and it was way longer than I think you anticipated for these segments. So I'm just going to read what I wrote you initially, and hopefully it falls within that range. And so here we go. There's so much to say, but I'll just leave you with a few breakdowns to supplement your perspective. Virgo, Virgo. V is descending, I is incarnate, R is reflect, G is spirit, O is full or whole. To me, Virgo speaks to the entry point, our incarnation within the physical plane, so as to experience reality. The go, or spirit or full or whole, is akin to the river of energy continually flowing and cycling, carrying soul the optimized blueprint or image downward so as to be realized, and the energy of our experience upward so as to iterate on soul, thus creating the next image. When we incarnate, we step into this river, and depending on our level of awareness of self, its current may or may not pull us under and or carry us away. Often associated with Virgo is the idea of Virgin Mary. So let's take a look at those words too. Virgin, Virgin. V is descending, I is incarnate, R is reflect. G is spirit, I is incarnate, N is normalized. And then Mary, MA is a letter pairing that I infer as physical, R is reflect, Y is render. The way I perceive it, Virgo becomes the virgin once normalized to, or brought into balance with, the physical plane. And the virgin is named Mary in recognition of our physical expression, normalized and rendered, so as to be observed, witnessed, and seen as a participant in reality's co-creative game. One might posit that Virgo only becomes the Virgin Mary once balance of Libra is realized. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks for the opportunity again to share my perspective, and I look forward to listening to this pod. Take care. Bye.
All right, Pete, thank you so much for that contribution. I hadn't really considered too much of the etymological breakdown of Virgo or Virgin Mary. So I appreciate you just bringing that to the table here. And there's a couple of interesting takeaways. As an example, you said you interpret MA for Mary as being physical. That's kind of interesting because matter, as an example, right, starts with MA, and there's other words that I can think of that start with MA that does relate to that. And I think there's room for interpretation here, right, as well. But also, I just wanted to add my own kind of etymological understanding of virgin. I think it's really interesting that virgin has right there, virgin. And I always look out for words. And so when you look into you are, or words that have that within it, and there's a ton of them, you find out that actually means primordial or original. So virgin, right? Mercury, brother, her. There's a million words that have right there, and I'm always paying attention to that. So the fact that it's in virgin, I think, is interesting. Also, verge in. There's an inward dynamic with Virgo and virginity and just what it represents and what it means and the Hermit card and everything else. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. That in within virgin is super interesting because of that. Also, the Hermit card, it's the 9th card of the Major Arcana, and I was talking about the number 9 earlier. The number 9, literally, N-I-N-E. In is right there in the middle of the word 9, right? And so my favorite type of wordplay is to find words within words. And so you can't deny that the in within virgin is actually pretty significant. So thanks again.
My name is Trixie, and I have a Virgo moon, and I'm an artist. I feel the thing about my Virgo side is that I love things to put things in. I love containers, organization, labels, being very detail oriented, but also embodying the thing, I think, is the aspect of Virgo that gets overlooked a lot. Like, you get to a point of mastery where it's just embodiment and it doesn't even register as mastery because it's just so integrated. And then the other thing that I always think of with Virgo is something the astrologer mystic Medusa put out a couple years ago in a newsletter, which is that the word Virgo may come from virago, which meant unmarried, kind of warrior maiden. So it was a much different take on what the unmarried and the virgin was, as you've mentioned. But I think that's a really important part because the Christian kind of overlay of youth and untouched sexuality and all that stuff, I think, is kind of the opposite. And that sort of unlocked a lot for me when I heard that.
All right, Trixie, thank you for that. The main takeaway here for me was the potential etymological correspondence with virago, warrior maiden, with Virgo. As I kind of said earlier, there's a number of strength cards that portray the woman on the card, which I associate heavily with Virgo, as being a warrior. Literally wearing armor, literally looks as though she's about to go and fight. And as we know, too, there are multiple species in the animal kingdom where the woman is the more ferocious gender, basically, where the feminine is the more ferocious gender between the two. Even as an example, a human mother who's trying to protect her children will do amazing things to protect her children, right? And so to me, this is something that really can't be taken away from woman, just this primal, warrior-like kind of quality. I think that in the solarized world, this sort of patriarchal kind of world that we live in, we like to think of women as being one particular kind of way, orderly, passive, and basically we want them to be polite and all of this other kind of stuff, right? And in actuality, this is a complete neutering of the totality or full spectrum that is what a woman represents, basically, right? So that's kind of the main thing that I took away from that one.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you went into the protection realm because that's what came up for me thinking about this. And what also came through after hearing Trixie talk about her thoughts is the Vestal Virgins. And while I was doing research for Virgo, I came across things about the Vestal Virgins, and I've heard this term, throughout my adult life, and then reading into who they were and what they did. Their main gig was to be protecting the eternal flame, the central eternal flame, which was a very important job. And then the woman's role of being the protector of the hearth, or the one that tends to the hearth of the home, and how important the hearth is to a home, and all of the things that come with the hearth, whether it be warming the home or cooking food, or basically just being a source of life. And so to me, that's really, really cool when you think about the protection aspect and what the Vestal Virgins were doing.
Right. No, it reminds me a little bit of the Justice card, in that it's Lady Justice, and we often associate justice with being feminine, not masculine. And she's depicted as holding a sword and also holding scales. There's a whole big weave with Virgo being related to justice and peace and Libra and Estrella and also Scorpio. That these three signs right next to each other, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, you can go on and on and on and on about how interrelated all three of them are, and their main symbolism, how they all kind of correspond with each other in one way or another. And so I bring that up, though, because she's holding a sword, and there's an element of protection there as well. And she's guarding a gateway, and woman has to protect her own gateway, right? And so there's just an innate dynamic with woman having that receptive yoni womb dynamic, that basically she's encouraged to protect herself and to protect her inner sanctum, basically, is kind of what it amounts to. And so the idea of protection of self also extends over to the protection of children. I would say even more strongly than a man's role. That I would say traditional symbolism for men, there's a lot of it that has to do with like traveling and all this other stuff. But it's really more of woman's kind of instinct and inclination to protect the home, because that's her space. Just like what you're saying, protecting the flame, protecting the hearth, etc. Also kind of related to that, there's a whole deep weave with different goddesses and blades. And that blade symbolism has a very strong feminine correspondence as well. That was kind of unknown to me until the last few years. But once you see it, it's very, very strong. All right, and this final voicemail comes from a special guest. This is our friend Sarah, and I've long wanted to have her on the show, actually, and I figured Virgo season was the perfect time to have her join us. And she's coming in with a chunky voicemail, but it is excellent and well worth it. And then, of course, we'll discuss.
So these are thoughts on Virgo for Mario. I'm going to be pulling from a variety of sources. So for reference, we're going to be using a Babylonian star map as laid out by Gavin White in his book, Babylonian Star Lore. We're also going to be looking at the Greek star map, as well as the zodiacs and star maps as laid out in Dendera in Egypt. We're also going to be pulling from a couple of different sources. Hesiod's Theogony, for one. He was around 750 to 650 BC, about the same time as Homer, some of his writings. We're also going to be looking at the Greek poet Aratus, who was 240 to 310 BC, Virgil, the Eclogues, and he was 70 to 19 BC. He was a Roman poet. We're also going to be going over some pieces from Nonus, who's a Greek poet who was 5th century AD, a little excerpt from Milton's Paradise Lost, and just touching with the Metamorphosis of Ovid. So there is a lot to pick apart when we're looking at Virgo and just the representations through the ages. Her first appearance, of course, is going to be in our Babylonian star maps, as well as the Mula Pen, when it talked about where the stars would be in relation to weather phenomenon, as well as making prophecies in regards to kings and how well the kingdom or the land would do in such times. Now, in the Babylonian star maps, she is shown and referred to as the furrow. And there she's holding a stalk of barley. But there is also another picture close by, which is called the frond, which is a frond of date palm. In later depictions of Virgo, we can actually see her holding both of these, both the frond of the date palm as well as the barley. Oftentimes we'll see Virgo pictured with wings. We see that as we move into the Greek and the Arabic versions of Virgo. But one thing interesting to note is that the Arabic version, she's not holding anything in either hand, but the right hand is severed at the elbow and placed into the right thigh, which is just a curious notation. As we look at the meanings associated with both the frond and the furrow, we see that these are things closely associated with life for the people of Mesopotamia. The date palm and barley were major staples. So here we see the associations with the harvest and her connection to the land, as well as blessing of the land and bringing forth that harvest. We also see in the Babylonian star maps that there is a little known goddess who is associated with the furrow specifically, named Sala, and she was the wife of Adad, who was a storm god. So the two of them together, you have a storm god who brings forth rain to the land, and a goddess who's holding barley. And that their marriage was kind of a marriage of the weather to the land, providing that bountiful harvest. So oftentimes you'll see on entitlement stones and boundary stones a depiction of the furrow, which is that barley stalk, together with a lightning bolt to represent that marriage between the two of them. In addition to the Babylonian depictions, we also see the Greek depictions and the Egyptian depictions with Virgo as the maiden, not only holding something in her hand, such as a stalk of whether it be barley, wheat, corn has even been used in some depictions, or the date palm. But just below, we see a goddess who's seated and holding a child in her hand. Now, that's known as the Isis lactans in many representations, and that's Isis nursing baby Horus. It's also been equated with the Virgin Mary and breastfeeding Jesus. And as we move into some of the mythology surrounding Virgo and what some of these ancient writers had written about this particular constellation, we'll see that there is actually a prophecy that comes through that talks about this blessed son, this child being born, that was going to cause great change and bring about a golden era. But what's interesting is that we also have goddesses associated with this constellation who have a child, but it is not a male child, it's actually a female child. And that association can be seen between Demeter, who is a harvest goddess, and her daughter Persephone, the changing of the seasons, moving from summer to fall to winter. And then we'll also see that with the goddess that we're really going to be focusing on, which is Astraea. And she is actually given the child of Aphrodite and Adonis to nurse and to teach and to guide, which I found was a real fascinating association. So as we move into this, which is what I wanted to focus on, Astraea is a goddess who has been long associated with the constellation of Virgo, and specifically its main star Spica. And Astraea was the daughter of Eos, who was the goddess of the dawn, and Astraeus, who was the god of dusk as well as the winds. He was basically the father of the winds, and she was one of their many children, Dawn and Dusk, and her name literally translates to star or star-like. And she was known as Virgin, goddess of justice, in a sense, purity, precision, and she's often conflated with the goddess known as Dike in Greek, and she was the goddess of justice. So we can also see an association now of Virgo moving into the next door constellation of Libra with the scales. And here we start to see the connection with justice. And even sometimes there's been mention of another goddess, the goddess Nemesis, who, though her name sounds scary, she was actually more a balancer of the scales. Her main job was to correct hubris, which was pride, specifically in humans before the gods. But she was not so much an enemy as someone who came to restore balance, who did punish, but it was more to set rights to wrong. It was balancing of the scales, so to speak. So Astraea is conflated and associated with all of these, and all of these have that connection to Virgo as well as the scales of Libra. And we see that many of these writers that I had listed before in the beginning start to talk about this. And we begin to see that, she is this celestial virgin. She rules over justice, modesty, good faith, and she is there together, according to the Greeks, living with men on the earth. And she was there amongst mankind, as like an ambassador of the gods, and that as men began to develop, well, it goes through the various ages. We have the golden age to the silver age, and then we finally get down to this iron age. And during this iron age, men have now developed weapons, and they are using them to fight against one another, to kill each other, to kill the land. And there's just so much misery and war and anger that this goddess Astraea, she decides to leave the earth, and she flees up and becomes the constellation of Virgo, specifically stationed in the main star Spica. But then we begin to see these prophecies and these writings that talk about her return, and that her return is going to restore the reign of Saturn, and that a child will be born, and that child is going to redeem that golden age, which is real interesting to note because a lot of these writings were actually written before Jesus. And one of the things that I've often thought about was when it talks about that virgin birth of Jesus, was that perhaps just a reference to the time of the year, to pinpoint when exactly he was born? Now, we all pretty much know that it most likely was definitely not Christmas as we know it now, December 25th, because very clearly in those writings within the Bible, it states that shepherds were laying out with their flocks of sheep in the fields. And we know that that area is located in the northern hemisphere. So the time of year that shepherds would actually be doing that would be summer to fall. Like it gets very, very cold in the desert in that region. So they're not going to be sleeping out under the stars during that time. And wouldn't it be funny if the virgin birth just was a depiction of when Jesus was born, whether his sun is in Virgo, his moon, whatever that be. Just an interesting side piece, an interesting thought. So going back to what is written about Estrella in regards to this Virgo constellation, one of the most interesting pieces is that I found most interesting was Virgil. And what he had written in his eclogues, it's the fourth portion of that, is a prophecy that also pulls in one of the Sibyls of the ancient times, the Cumaean Sibyl. She was an oracle of Apollo, and of course Sibyl means prophetess. So these were oracular women who spoke prophecies that were recorded. And this one specifically was located in a Greek colony near Naples, Italy. Many a times they lived in caves and other dwellings and would share their prophecies with those that came. And what Virgil writes, and this is translation from the Latin, is now is come the last age of the Cumaean prophecy. The great cycle of periods is born anew. Now returns the maid, which is Virgo, whether it's translated Virgin Justice, maid, maiden, virgin, Estrella. Now returns the maid, returns the reign of Saturn. Now from high heaven a new generation comes down. Only favor the child who's born pure, Lucina, under whom the first race of iron shall end, and a golden race rise up throughout the world. Now your Apollo reigns. And Lucina means light in Latin. It was one of the many titles of Juno, sometimes Diana. But you can see here that when Virgo, Estrella, Virgin Justice, returns to the earth, she's going to return the reign of Saturn. And what that brings to mind is a picture that Mario loves to use when he talks about Virgo, and also one of my favorites, is that of a woman who is standing next to a broken pillar. And she has this long, kind of wild hair. And standing behind her is an old man who's actually kind of very gently playing with her hair. And next to him, we see a giant sickle, scythe, so to speak. So we see an implement of whether it be Saturn or the Grim Reaper or Father Time, however you want to view that. And here we have specifically a prophecy that's touching down on this connection between Virgo and Saturn. And another interesting thing to think about is, all of our depictions of death and the maiden. Like Virgo even reaches across the scales of Libra to touch down on Scorpio, because what does that constellation of Scorpio represent? in the tarot, but the death card. So we see death in the Maiden. We can also think about the whole cycle of Persephone descending to Hades, the Maiden descending down into the realms of the underworld to death. There's just so many connections that Virgo reaches across to, including over to Leo. She kind of dances with all of the constellations around her, and we can see connections between them all, which is just truly fascinating. This is one of the most interesting constellations, and so much has been written about. But after Virgil, we have even more talk of this constellation. And one that I found real interesting is in John Milton's Paradise Lost. We have this part where Satan is discovered in the Garden of Eden, brought before Gabriel, the archangel. The two are on the verge of war. And here we hear this piece that says, God the Eternal hung forth in heaven his golden scales, yet seen betwixt Astraea and the Scorpion sign, wherein all things created first he weighed, the pendulous round earth with balanced air and counterpose now ponders all events, battles, and realms. Another very interesting piece. And then going back to Astraea and the child. So there is a part in the writings of Nonus, who was a Greek poet in the 5th century, where he speaks about Astraea as being a starry nurse of the universe, as nursing and taking care of and nourishing the daughter of Aphrodite and Adonis, who was known as Beroe. And she also had some other names later on, but she was nursed on the breast of Astraea. And Astraea fashioned a necklace out of spica for her, for this daughter. And she was mortal, but also part goddess. And she was pursued by both Dionysus and Poseidon. Ultimately, Poseidon was the victor in wooing her. But it was very interesting for me to find that there was a daughter involved in all of this. And again, we see the nursing of the child at the breast. Same with the Isis lactans, the Virgin Mary and child. So we see that there are both sons and daughters represented in all of this. And that one of the interesting things is that she will come back to us, that she will return. And when she does, a golden age is supposed to be attributed to that. So we can associate that with all of the stories of the different saviors of mankind. But perhaps, once again, it's just a piece on that constellation wheel that just denotes a certain marker of time for us to pay attention to. But there's just so much to dig into. And thank you for letting me share some thoughts. Thank you, Mario. Bye.
Okay, Sarah, thank you so much for bringing it. That was awesome. There's a lot to chew on. There's a lot of threads we can pull at. I'll say the first thing I want to mention is this idea of Astraea's return relating to the return of a golden age, right? And how that relates to Saturn. That resonates very strongly with me because Saturn was the ruling planet of the last golden age. If you guys watched our couple of episodes that we did on this, it was called the Lost Lore of Saturn series, basically, you'll know what I'm talking about. It makes so much sense that Saturn relates to the Golden Age. And one of the things we talked about in that little series was the idea of Saturn actually being viewed as more of a feminine sort of presence, which is in contrast to how most people see Saturn today, right? But Saturn has a very strong relationship with the center. And so a lot of people talk about Saturn being related to boundaries and restrictions and things like that. Also very much related to contraction. And so I always think of this being in contrast to Jupiter's expansive nature. Jupiter's always talked about in that way, expansive and grand and larger than life and everything else. Saturn has more of this contractive sort of dynamic. Well, if something contracts far enough, where is it actually going? It's going to the center. And so my personal opinion is all things emanate from the center and return back to that same center. And authors like Rene Guénon have essentially said that the biggest difference between the last golden age and the current dark age that we find ourselves in is literally the loss of the center itself. So people aren't centered. People are ungrounded and everything else, which is why we're living in sort of this dark age. And so if there's ever a return of the golden age, people will have their centers restored and sort of the reverence for the center and all these other things. So when I think of Astrea's return in that way, I can't not think of the fact that I see Virgo, the Virgin Mary, Isis, Astrea. I really see these goddesses and queens and whatnot, these maidens, as being related to the northern sky. And that would be the center of the heavens, right? The North Star being the center of the wheel of heaven that all other stars revolve around. There's a major world axis correspondence here. As an example, earlier we talked about the Virgin Mary having this relationship with the fleur-de-lis. The fleur-de-lis, on a lot of old compasses and compass roses, that was the icon that was used to indicate the arrow that points north. And so south, west, and east just had normal arrows, but north was the only arrow that actually had a fleur-de-lis on it. You can find examples of this all over the place. And I'm getting ready to do a presentation about all of this stuff. And I've talked about it in a lot of other presentations up to this point. But to me, it's a return to this northern sort of correspondence, or what I like to say too, this sort of polar tradition, you know, in many ways, that there is this, once you look into it, there's this undeniable relationship with the polar tradition and the golden age, or what you can refer to as the northern tradition, right? And so I think that this makes a lot of sense in a lot of respects. And also it just makes a lot of sense that since we've fallen away from this golden age, since man has had this fall from grace away from the center, away from polar symbolism and whatnot, what's taken over? I've talked about this many times, but we went through a great shift from polar symbolism to solar symbolism. So when you really break that down and really get into it, basically we live in a solar age, right? And so this is why the quote-unquote patriarchy exists right now. And so what has happened in that sort of transition is that the feminine, the divine feminine, if you want to put it that way, has been swept kind of under the rug. It's kind of been put in a more passive role. It's behind the scenes, right? And so if we're going to get back to a golden age, that also is going to return. That understanding the feminine and all these different qualities that correlate with it, that's also going to return. And so there's so much goddess symbolism associated with the northern sky. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Same thing with god symbolism as well. There's king and queen symbolism. It's really all-encompassing. So if people are hearing me talk about this for the first time, I suggest you watch my presentation called Esoteric Solar Symbolism, the Rising Sun, or you watch my presentation called The Pleiadians. And this is where I get into it the most, that the sort of earliest symbolic framework can best be described as polar or northern in nature, and that there's been this great symbolic shift to all things sort of solar, which is interesting because what it's kind of really saying too, that in the modern world, it's the sun, literally the sun, the golden sun, but also the child that is taking all of the focus and is sort of what's at the kind of top of the hierarchy for a lot of people, not the woman. It kind of echoes the same sentiments of the Gnostic creation story I was talking about, that the demiurge thinks that he's the supreme deity, but in actuality, there's a god above God, and it's the goddess, aka his mother. So I'm of the opinion that a lot of what's going on in today's world is backwards and it's inverted. And you can kind of see that in the media and in pop culture, that the child and youthfulness is what is put on a pedestal, aka the sun, but everything related to the feminine or even the crone and all of those different attributes, that is what is kind of put into the corner and is kind of ignored, in today's world. But it's going to come back at some point. It has to, and sort of the way the modern mind is, it's not really sustainable. It can't last forever. And so I see it that when we swing back, we're going to be swinging back to polar symbolism. And therefore, we're also going to be swinging back to basically understanding ourselves in its truest essence and returning back to our center when people start following sort of their symbolic true north, once again. And so when is that going to happen? I have no idea. But it's kind of interesting as well because there's symbolism with this that relates to the age of Aquarius. And the card that corresponds with Aquarius is the star card, very much emblematic, in my opinion, of the North Star. In fact, this is the card that I'm going to get into in my Symbolic Secrets series next. And Aquarius, the old ruling planet of Aquarius, was Saturn. So is the age of Aquarius actually a return of all this symbolism? And Estrella relates to the stars. And I would say that Virgo, Estrella, basically, it's the same woman that you're seeing in the star card. And it's the same woman that you're seeing in the strength card. It's the same woman in the high priestess card. It's the same woman in the empress card. Just like what someone said, Virgo has 1,000 names, or Isis has 1,000 names. There's 1,000 expressions for the same goddess, and you see her littered throughout the major arcana. The whole thing is that it's the same goddess, in my opinion. I know people kind of get triggered with that, but with symbolism, you tend to see more similarities over differences, and you tend to see how they all relate to each other, not necessarily how they differ from each other.
I like her thought that this golden age coming back is perhaps just a point on the zodiacal wheel that we're supposed to recognize. And I think that I can see both sides of this. I can see what you're saying of there is going to be a return to this golden age, because I also believe that's true too. Just like every cycle, there's always an end to the cycle and a brand new cycle that begins. But if there's more of a focused way that we can look at this, or there's more of a relatable way for us to see this in our everyday or yearly cycle, it would be that this time of year is the golden time of year because we're speaking of harvest. You're thinking of the golden fields of wheat and the wheat connection and the barley connection that is coming through as well with Virgo. And so I really like that because it's actually a little bit more relatable to us. And it's easier, I think, for someone, or speaking for myself, to think about the golden age being related to the golden time of year that we are now entering. And so to kind of even shrink it down to make it more accessible for someone to think about, I think that's a really great point that Sarah brought up.
Well, it's certainly the golden time of year. Absolutely.
It really is.
Between Leo and Virgo, for sure. And it's interesting as well. We haven't mentioned it in this episode, I don't think, but the ancient Egyptians saw that the beginning of the year started in Virgo. That there was a point in time where the beginning of the year was Virgo, the end of the year was Leo. And that's what people have said with the Sphinx, is that the head represents Virgo and the body represents Leo. So together they represent the totality of the year, the alpha and omega of the year, basically. One of the other things I wanted to mention here as well is she brought up the dynamic of the golden child, or Horus and Isis, or Christ and the Virgin, suckling on their mother's teat, basically, right? Getting mother's milk. And so this reminds me of the idea of, we call our galaxy the Milky Way galaxy. And there's a couple of different ways of looking at that. Mother's milk. It could also be the milk from a cow, which is kind of a common interpretation related to Taurus season and things like that. But I was preparing for this episode and I was reading through some of my books, and I thought it was really interesting that there are a couple of myths out there that basically suggest that the stars of the Milky Way galaxy actually are little ears of wheat, basically. That they're little grains of wheat, pretty much. And that there is this dynamic of considering the stars having this sort of wheat correspondence. And what is our sun? You know, it's a star, right? So there's a correspondence that you can make there, right? Between wheat, the night sky, the sun, etc. And with all that said, that concludes this episode on Virgo symbolism. Hopefully you guys got something out of that. We will see you shortly for an episode on the symbolism of Libra.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, this concludes the live recording Michelle and I made on Monday, August 25th. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who submitted something, but especially Emily Ridout, Josh with a Branch, Sarah Henlin, and Katriena Emmanuel, our special guests for this episode. The ever insightful Emily Ridout can be found at astroyoga.org if you're curious about her astrological or yoga services. She's also hosting an 8-day Icelandic astro yoga retreat this October, if that's something that interests you. Feel free and reach out to Emily directly if you have any questions. Once again, all of her information can be found at astroyoga.org. Josh with a Branch can be found here and there online. I've included his link tree in the description, which is probably the easiest way to find his accounts. Sarah's Instagram account can be found at Sarah_Henlin if you want to follow her posts, and that's Sarah, SAHRA_Henlin. And Sarah, thanks again for everything you brought to the table today. That was great. Katriena from Australia not only has amazing symbolic insights, but she's also a gifted photographer as well. You can see her work and find her other links at KatrienaEmmanuel.com. That's KatrienaEmmanuel.com. Also, in case you weren't aware, I'm available for tarot readings, symbolic birth chart readings, and study sessions. It's truly a pleasure to meet all of you and talk symbolism. You can book a session on my site, symbolicstudies.com, or as always, you can reach me at 503-893-4606 for more information. I'm also a graphic designer, in case you weren't aware. In fact, that is how I came across symbolism. If you have a project that you're working on and you're in need of a symbolically literate designer, go to my site, check out my portfolio, and get in touch. As always, for exclusive content, head on over to patreon.com/symbolicstudies or symbolicstudies.com/secrets. I post weekly updates every weekend. Every other weekend, I post something exclusive just for supporters. As an example, this podcast is available a week early for subscribers. Without a doubt, this is the best way to keep up with everything I have to offer, and it's just $5 a month. And that's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you next month with a show on the symbolism of Libra. See you then.